Anyway, hi. I am someone who has very strong opinions about why Balloon Fight is better than Joust. And also maybe some stuff about game design, aesthetics, and things. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But before we do that, just to give some people some background on who I am, why I'm talking about this. There we go. So my name's Adrian Sandoval. I'm formerly a game designer with Island Officials Games, who, by the way, have a game called Grumble right now in the Mivs Arcade. You should totally go play that. It's great. When I was there, I worked on some Nintendo DS titles, as well as some mobile games, including Orion's Odyssey, and then On My Way was something I did with, we did with the Tourette's Association of America. Currently, I'm teaching game history at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. I do some writing occasionally for the website Hardcore Gaming 101, which some of you may be familiar with. I've done some articles on the website, usually for their Kusage section, as well as some of the books they've written. Like I wrote if you have the Data Arcade Classic, they did like a Data East collection of all the games in there, and I wrote a very long retrospective on Magical Drop. And then the newest book they had, the NES Cult Classics, which I've got pictured there. I talked about like the Flintstones game, the Jetsons game, the Felix game. Basically got to talk about old games and old animation, two of my favorite topics. I'm also the chair of the Philadelphia chapter of the International Game Developers Association, which is an advocacy group for game developers. Another thing you need to know about me is that when I was younger, ever since I was like a really young age, I've always been really super inquisitive. I really always wanted to understand why it was that I liked the things that I liked, why I enjoyed those things. And to a degree that like a lot of other people didn't understand. It was like, why can't you just like watch this thing and enjoy it? Like, why do you have to like keep breaking it down? And that's just how I've always been. And when I was really getting into game design back in college, there just wasn't really a lot of resources out there, not like there is now, about that topic that you could at least just like reach out and get there. So I had to ask myself a lot of questions about why I enjoyed the games that I liked. So now one of my big goals in teaching and writing about games and game design is to take those questions that I had and really break them down and in a way that's easy to understand and palatable for other people who kind of want to make games or just kind of understand why I did, like why they might enjoy them. And that kind of formed the basis of this particular presentation, because there was a question I asked myself. But before I get too far into that, I don't know how many people are unfamiliar with the two games we're talking about, considering the very specific nature of the subject. But I do want to go into a little bit of history. So at this point, I think it's like fairly common knowledge that Nintendo is a very old company, like over a century old. When they started as a playing card company in like the 1800s with the Hanafuda cards. Nintendo doesn't really talk too much about the time between the Hanafuda cards and doing video games, but they pivoted into a lot of different areas. Like, they had a TV network at one point, they were doing like instant food, they also did love hotels for people familiar with that concept. Ask me later if you don't know what that is. But it was really the entertainment business where Nintendo starts to see a lot of success. And you also get to see the Nintendo that we kind of know and love today. They did all kinds of mechanical amusements in the arcades, and they even converted like whole bowling alleys in Japan into the crazy virtual clay shooting arenas that you kind of see here. And if you've played Duck Hunt, you know the clay shooting, that's kind of what that's referencing. And a little bit later on, they entered the toy market, and they made all of these really cool mechanical toys that are the kind of things that I would have loved to have had, like in the 80s or in America. I've got a few pictured here. These came from the website Before Mario. If you've never read that blog before, it's really fascinating. You get a really good breakdown on all of these things. Some of the stuff you're seeing here, the game over there on the side that kind of looks like Crossfire, it basically is Crossfire, but it's called Wild Gunman. And it's like, if you've played the NES game or even like know about, they had an amusement game that used live action video even before that's what that's referencing. You got a remote control car based on Mach Rider, the Ultra Hand, which was developed by the Game Boy creator Gunpei Yokoi. I'm going to butcher some names here, that's going to happen. But so Nintendo really established themselves as being really true innovators, and it's actually why Nintendo had to get out of the toy business, because toys are known for being like cheap things that you can produce new products really, really fast. And Nintendo was obviously not interested in doing that. And I always thought it was kind of surprising that if you look back at their really early arcade offerings, like the really early stuff, they're very derivative. You've got a lot of Block Breakers, a lot of Space Invaders clones. And that was very prevalent in the 80s. You know, technology was young, there were a lot of limitations. This wasn't a lot of ideas to go around. So it's not like Nintendo was the only people doing this, but that was something that was happening. And you might know that in 1981, they made a very pretty Space Invaders / Galaga clone called Radar Scope that looked really good and kind of played a little bit better than a lot of those games, but it still didn't do very well. So Nintendo turned that into what we know now as Donkey Kong. I gave Shigeru Miyamoto, he worked on Sheriff as an artist, but otherwise his first real chance to do a game. And they replaced all of the arcade cabinets for Radar Scope with Donkey Kong. Now, and I don't really need to discuss what a landmark title Donkey Kong is, but I think it's really important to remember that in history there's no one turning point, you know? Just really visible, really popular ones. And even like Donkey Kong, a lot of the innovations that we really know it for, power-ups and how that related to game design, you know, it had a narrative, which Miyamoto felt very strong about. These are all things that Pac-Man did in the year before. You know, and if I'm not taking away from Donkey Kong, I think that Donkey Kong is an amazing game, and honestly, I would rather play it than Pac-Man. I think it's, you know, just mechanic-wise, it's very fun in that way. But I just think it's really important to remember, Nintendo's not the only innovator out there, and especially I think in this time, I don't know if the West gets as much credit for how innovative like what they were doing was as well. I mean, probably more this period than say the NES period, but like Williams especially in the early arcade is doing all of this really great stuff with the digitized voice in Sinistar, dual stick games had been around before Robotron, but Robotron really solidified like what they are, and I'd say that most of the ones that we still play today more come from the Robotron vibe. And then Joust is huge, and that's the one we're talking about today. This really innovative multiplayer, it's kind of co-op, it's kind of competitive game that he didn't really want it to have a space theme. That's why they decided to do birds, because they still wanted to have flying, and then they centered all of the mechanics around that flying idea, and that's where the name Joust came from. And we're going to get more into that and the mechanics a little bit later. What I want to move on to is about 2 years after that, Nintendo starts working on the Famicom, and they want to release it in North America. The Game Crash is like on the brink, but it hasn't quite happened yet. And before they decided to just do it on their own with Nintendo of America, they had HAL Laboratories, who you might know for doing the Kirby games, Smash Brothers games. They had HAL Laboratories do a port of several different Williams arcade games to Famicom to try and entice Atari, because they wanted Atari to distribute the Famicom in the United States, which would have been a very different thing had that had happened. But Atari wanted to see it through. They were working on the 7200 at the time, so they just wanted to do their own thing. So now you'll see that the Joust version that they made, that HAL Laboratories made, did come to Nintendo of America. I've got it pictured here with the box and the title screen, and you can see HAL America, which doesn't, that division of HAL doesn't exist anymore. But what I really want you to notice is the copyright on the title screen. It says 1988. So that's a full like 5 or 6 years after they had developed this thing before it actually came out. And what happened was, what they decided to do is that instead of releasing the NES version of Joust, they went ahead and just took the game and basically turned it into Balloon Fight. It was first released in 1984 for the Nintendo Versus lines of arcades. If you've never seen the Nintendo Versus lines, I don't know if they have any in the arcade right now. But basically they were meant to like entice people on the Nintendo Entertainment System before it came to America. Like, these are what the games are, this is what you're going to get to play. And then it was one of the launch titles. There was a home port, which was specifically worked on by Satoru Iwata, famously, who would go on to be the president of Nintendo America. So all of this history, all of this context meant absolutely nothing to me as a kid. I played these games, again, none of that context, but I came away with this impression. I absolutely adored Balloon Fight. I loved Balloon Fight as a kid. I also had the Balloon Kid, the little-known sequel on Game Boy, which I loved even more. And I had absolutely no clue what was going on when I played Joust. No idea. Like, I would try and play the game, and like I would just kind of be amused by like the flapping and everything, but like I would just like hit objects, nothing would happen, and I was like, okay. And later on, when I was told that they're basically the same game, I mean, now by that time I had already figured out how to play Joust. Like I was probably in my 20s when this knowledge kind of became at least known on the internet, and I even enjoyed Joust. But for some reason I never just made that connection that Balloon Fight was a clone. So that's what got me thinking, and this is the question I mentioned earlier. Why did I enjoy playing the clone as a kid, and yet I found the original game to be fairly inscrutable? And like at this point, I don't know, considering you all came here seeing the name of the talk, how many people are familiar with either of the games?
Oh, Balloon Fight.
Okay, cool. So Balloon Fight. Okay, so let's do the split. Are more people familiar? Who are more or less more familiar with Balloon Fight? Okay, portion. And then Joust. Okay, that's actually like a good 50-50. That's interesting. Well, and I didn't have both, of course. Okay, great, cool. All right, so I am going to just go over quickly with the rules, the objectives, and all that, even though it does feel like everybody's at least got a fairly idea of one or the other. But like they both share the same rules and objectives. They're part of what we call the clear 'em up genre. I guess some people call it the clear 'em up genre. Basically meaning that the goal is to clear the game of all of your opponents. But what makes it unique to other games in this genre, like say Bubble Bobble, is that the enemies, including the other human opponents, follow the same rules of movement and attacking the player. In order for someone to be knocked out, the attacking player has to bump their opponent at a higher elevation than the other player. That's basically how you play Joust, with the exception of the way that you move, which is what makes it very unique. Basically, your character can move left to right along the ground, but in order to actually fly, you have to press the button rapidly to start lifting off the ground. So you start accelerating very slowly, but if you keep tapping the button, eventually you're just going to be like zipping around the stage, wild abandon, and you kind of have to like have a rhythm to actually be able to like really control your character. Like everything that you hit, including if you hit someone of equal elevation, you just kind of bounce off of like a rubber ball. So you kind of have to like really quickly like gain your altitude like back and fight gravity before you get like back into the swing of things. And there are some different obstacles between the two games, and there are some like really finite differences with like the movement mechanics and the way gravity works. But for otherwise, these games are more or less the same. So I guess if the next thing we have to look at is what place do they differ? So when I thought about that, I realized it's safe to kind of say both games have a very different aesthetic. They have a very, and in this case I'm using that to mean art style. Neither game was really realistic, right? But Joust goes for a more gritty kind of fantasy look, based on both the decisions of, I think I missed saying his name earlier, John Newcomer, who worked on the game, and plus the concept and promotional artwork of Python Angelo, who did a lot of arcade cabinet artwork, and well, he did 2 arcade cabinet and mostly did pinball stuff, but very famously known for doing the Joust art. Well, Balloon Fight, I would say, is a little bit more abstract. I wrote surreal down here, but they're both kind of surreal in different ways. And it's using what was called the Nintendo house style. Nintendo house style is very inspired by the art of Shigeru Miyamoto, who, Donkey Kong, Mario, and it resembles something kind of like a Western animation cartoon of the 1940s and 50s, which were the cartoons that like really inspired Miyamoto. It kind of has like a slight anime twist. And what I really want to stress, that when I'm talking about the aesthetic style between the two, I'm not talking about what I personally prefer. Now, I'm a fan of animation, like I mentioned. I love cartoons, so yeah, I'm naturally inclined to like the Balloon Fight style a little bit better. And I really adore the Nintendo house style, but looking at how the art styles affect game design, you can't just look at the formal distinctions. We really have to like understand how this art, the formal aspect of the art, works on a functional level. Okay. Now, this is the part where we're going to start getting really critical analysis heavy. If you couldn't tell from that last little bit of babbling I did. So I kind of want to make a couple of things clear. I said earlier when I was first studying game design that there weren't really a ton of resources on the internet. And you know, slowly things began to appear more and more with the advent of YouTube, and I know a lot of us are familiar with shows like Extra Credits or Game Maker's Toolkit, but especially like in the early days of this kind of analysis, there was, with game design specifically, there was a lot of terminology and ideas and words like elegance, conveyance, and you were just kind of expected to already know it. You were supposed to kind of just infer it based on context. Which never really worked for me. Like I really kind of had to like get in there and really like understand it a little bit better. And it got even more crazy when blogs and, you know, all these people who were academics and had been doing all of this research and had grown up on video games like I did, they all entered the arena and they started throwing all of their big pieces out there, and it just got really flooded with all these kind of like really unwieldy ideas. And you might be familiar with this one, where I feel like more attention was brought to how unwieldy this term was than it did for what it was actually talking about. I just want to clarify, we are not going to be talking about the word. That being said, if anyone wants to do a talk on the ludonarrative dissonance of Joust and Balloon Fight, I will absolutely go to that talk. So just throwing that out there, something to think about for next year. So there are two types of reactions that tend to happen when a person sees a phrase like this, or just a bunch of academic mumbo-jumbo in a lot of big lumps. Either your eyes begin to glaze over and then you just eventually hit the back button, or you just go into a stupor, or what I think is worse, you just kind of completely write off what's being said. And I want to stress that I think that either of these is an understandable reaction. Like, this is exactly what I did. And I would argue that the latter reaction is kind of an outright dangerous one. Like anything else, like learning both game design or critically examining media, I think this is the part where I should say that my bachelor's degree is in communications. But like anything else, that it's a skill. It requires time, it requires patience, and you kind of have to just be open to new ideas, because really all words like this, they're just tools. They're just learning and understanding, kind of like if you're doing music theory, what notes, scales, and chords are. We're just doing this with a growing and sometimes intimidating lexicon that's taking a lot of complex ideas and just compartmentalizing them down to a way that's easily digestible. Like if I like go on about like, you know, oh, you know, hey, this gameplay and that I'm doing doesn't really match like what the story is telling me. You take that and then you start talking about that and you just start like going off into like rambling nonsense. And that's just why like big terms like that just kind of come out. It's just easier to do that. And if you take the time to learn what they mean, you'll be able to, like, I feel like you'll be able to make your own games even better because you'll be able to apply that knowledge. Or if you're working on a team, you'll just be able to communicate your ideas more effectively. So I want to do that by moving back to Balloon Fight and Joust and kind of define what I mean when I say formal differences and functional differences. If you took Aesthetics 101 in college, then bear with me for 2 minutes. So when I say like talk about the form and what's formally different, when you're looking at any kind of design, architecture, painting, even like a cake or whatever, the formal aspects are when we're talking about the craftsmanship, right? Like a poem was written in iambic pentameter, or again, going to the music example, chord progression. So when I talk about like Balloon Fight's art style and versus Joust's balloon style, that's what I mean by their formal differences. And I kind of want to show you how they functionally work. And that's what I mean by when I say function, we're talking about like what feelings does the formal aspects evoke. So again, using that chord progression idea, you know, what feelings is that invoking in the listener, basically. So now I just want to kind of explain how I started to feel about those functional aspects of the visuals. Like, well, how do they function? What do they do for the person playing the game? And I think there were tools that were helpful, thankfully, defined by Don Norman in this really great book, The Design of Everyday Things. This is not a game design book specifically. I think it's more meant for like electrical engineers. There's some architecture talk in here, but it's really highly recommended for designers to read it. I really love this because it really helped me to like get a good understanding of how to deconstruct and interpret and utilize really good game design. And like even if that's like you're not like a game designer, it really just helps like communicate these ideas and these high-level concepts. And in the book, Don Norman, he identifies 5 psychological concepts that result in what's called discoverability. Literally what allows people to discover how the design of an object or a game work. So in this lecture, I'm only really concerned with 2, the affordances and signifiers. So an affordance, what's an affordance? So basically an affordance is everything you can possibly do with an object, what it affords the user to do. So for example, on let's say a chair, you can sit on a chair, you can stand on a chair, you can do whatever this is. You can tame lions. I don't really recommend this last one, just either for you or the lion, really. So that's what an affordance is. A signifier is literally a sign that explains how to use an object. And that can be literal. It can be an actual sign or a message that just says, hey, push, pull, I think is the most common example. But like, really, it doesn't have to be that. It can just be the thing itself. Did I go? It's skipping a slide on me. Oh no, there we go. Okay, cool. So literally, like, a handle implies that you pull. And if you've ever like encountered a door where it's the exact opposite, you see a handle and then you go and you can't open it, that's kind of an improper use of signifiers. That's why signifiers are really important in that way. Okay, so with that in mind, what are the signifiers of Joust? So I would say that the title is one, right? Like, again, you have the idea of clashing into each other, which is the goal of the game, right? You are two gladiators of some sort atop of flying bird creatures with lances, and that immediately gives us this idea of joust. And at least if you're familiar with medieval history, or at least spent an evening at medieval times, just two opponents trying to run into each other to knock each other off the mount. But I guess my question is this signifier really clearly communicating the rules of the game? I don't think it is, because I think without, at least if you haven't read instructions, and again, like when I'm talking about me as a child playing this, who knows how old I was, there's nothing that signifies explicitly the rule about higher elevation. The name Joust implies collision, but with that, you're just kind of left with the three potential possibilities or affordances that aren't really clearly signified. Either someone is eliminated for reasons that really you don't understand why, or you just kind of bounce off of each other and you're just kind of confused and confounded that really nothing else happened. So I hope that by like this point it's kind of obvious that how Balloon Fight avoids this issue. The balloons in the game are clear signifier. They're targets, really, for all opponents. I also like that Balloon Fight gives you an extra hit point essentially with two balloons. This allows the player to like make a mistake, and for first timers to kind of like understand the rules. And then you got these like guys with like the beaks, the big like pointy helmets right there, that kind of give you the indication of what's going to happen when that part hits the balloon. And I also think that it's worth noting that beyond that functional benefit, that it's the overall aesthetic that allows it to work, right? The form is harmoniously working with the function. Both games take place in a fantasy setting, but despite that, Joust's world is far less abstract. There's a fantastic idea of knights riding these giant flying ostriches, but I think that requires a little bit less suspension of disbelief than someone flapping their arms in order to gain altitude and fly around with balloon helmets. But Nintendo's house style, like I said, was based on Western cartoons and very similar to like Looney Tunes and the UPA animation at the time. In the same way that, like, say, the construction setting of Donkey Kong and Wrecking Crew, those both came from, there was a Popeye cartoon that I honestly just learned was the big inspiration for Donkey Kong, and that's why they used the construction setup. It was literally taken from this Popeye cartoon. And, in the same way, too, the balloon helmet feels like something that Wile E. Coyote might have ordered. Or, again, like this example I've got here, I mean, this is even more ridiculous. But, like, what's that?
I'm pretty sure Coyote did order
well, he definitely had that skin-tight suit that like had like the hang gliders attached to it at least.
It might have been like a propeller.
Yeah, right. So and my point is that it's really the art style that allows Balloon Fight logic to work, and because that logic works the way it does, the game, you can understand how to play it just by looking at the game. And that's what I kind of want the takeaway here to be, is that more likely these deliberate choices of art style and aesthetic allowed for creative decisions that communicated the game design far easier than Joust could. And so yeah, I see it as a way of form and function just kind of like working very harmoniously, and it's creating a more intuitive and ultimately, I would say, engaging experience for the player. Now, funny story, at this show, MAGFest 2019, I was just at the panel for talking about RCA computer history. I'm sitting in the front row, and there are two people, and one is explaining to his friend very passionately why he feels Joust is a better game than Balloon Fight. and I said it was going to be in the panel. And I turned to him and I was like, you really should come to this talk. Because the title is really meant to be facetious, like any other good title. I meant to be provocative to get attention. The truth of it is that the style of Joust does have its own functional advantages over Balloon Fight. For example, the area of the stage has a lot more free space for movement and a lot more different level design. So because you have more free space, and again, like because they have something that's slightly more abstract, you have these like smaller characters. So there's a lot more movement to go around. You can make far more mistakes than you could otherwise. And it's really the art style that allows them to do that. Actually, really funny. A friend of mine was a huge fan of the original Dragon Warrior. He loved the NES Dragon Warrior, and he always would tell me that how much he hated the new Dragon Warrior games. And in my head, I'm like, they're the same game. Like, Dragon Warrior famously has not really changed too much over the years, and every time they try to change it, fans get mad, and they go, okay, never mind, we're just going to keep doing the same thing again and again. And I was like, why do you not like it? And simply put, he didn't like it because it had anime in it. Now, Akira Toriyama has done the art for Dragon Warrior since the beginning, but because it was on the NES and the sprites were a lot more abstract, he could put his own imagination into it. And Joust, again, like being smaller and less detailed, you can imagine the art that Python Angelo was trying to do when you play the game. So again, that really did inform the design of Joust. So again, like I said, for the people in here who really came to really get heated over their fandom of Joust, don't worry, I really like Joust too. What I'm saying though, as a kid, one game was confusing, the other was engaging and intuitive, and I don't really want the takeaway of this talk to be one is better than the other. Really what I'm hoping you took from this is the meaning and importance of form, function, affordances, signifier, and how these tools can help you pick an artistic style and theme for your own games that work and help you create something that's really engaging, that's immediately intuitive and fun as soon as the player looks at it. Or just kind of, again, give you the tools to really be able to talk about games in this way. So that's basically it for me. I added so much more content to this, and I got through this faster than I've done in my rehearsals. So this is where you can find me. I'm at EBWiz on Twitter. That's my email address. That's my website. I also have cards if anyone needs them. I'm going to put these slides up later as well. I guess there's going to be a video recording of this on the MAGFest site at some point. But yeah, I'm just going to open up the questions now.
I did want to point out one thing. Very good job, by the way.
Thank you.
This is a highly subjective thing, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
We don't try to objectify these things because they are subjective.
Right.
Everybody has their opinion. What's good and what's not good. What's good game design. What's better game design, comparatively speaking, to another game. I would point out though that in the prior screenshot, if you want to go back one.
Yeah.
You made the point that I made earlier about the screen space, and I think it's not just the art style, but actually what I mentioned earlier was the whole idea of the sprites being smaller allows you to squeeze into tighter spaces and do more maneuver. And one of the things about the Balloon Fight is that if you look at the amount of vertical space you have compared to the amount of pixels on the screen,
pretty much, yeah.
You'll see that you don't have nearly as much maneuverability with your sprite, and I think that we could trivialize that, but I think there is an important thing to be said about that, because that does give you quite a lot of freedom of range and freedom of movement. In the early 80s, I was actually in quite a few Joust tournaments myself, so I know that these are the kinds of things that we really picked up on quite a lot back in the day, because these are things you had to know to get good.
Right.
I was quite familiar with Balloon Fight as well, and one of the things I would also point out is that one of the key differences between these two games is that I think people have to realize and understand that Joust was a game developed by John Newcomer to be an arcade game. Being an arcade game, it needed to be a game that would capture your attention like that. the 5 seconds literally, and a track mode, and you would walk by the game, you would see its operation, and you would sort of instinctively know, okay, this is what I need to do, this is how I need to play it. I drop a quarter into the machine, and I'm playing the game. So with the attract mode running, and the instruction card next to it that says joust higher than opponent to win.
Sure.
You could pick up on that. Now for me, it was perhaps a little bit different because I was in tournaments and stuff, so we kind of knew this. For a kid who's probably not tall enough to be able to see the instruction card, yeah, I mean, it can be a little bit daunting when you're there looking up at a machine and going, geez, I wonder what that's all about. Whereas Balloon Fight, you get a nice NES instruction manual, you can look through it, you can look through the pages and see how it's designed and how it's developed and what the rules of the game really are. So I'd like to, that's also, and one aspect of the game it's probably important for people to realize is that arcade game design is not really the same as console design, especially back then.
Right, and then that's why they added the balloon trip mode, which I didn't really talk about because it wasn't like pertinent to the talk at hand. But that being, and that being said, I think to add a little bit more context to that, and that's the thing, like all of these, we're all talking about historical artifacts here, and they all exist within the context of their time. When Joust came out, I would not be thought of for 2 years. I was born in 1984 when the Versus version of Balloon Fight came out. I just happened to have an NES when I formed Cognitive Thought and had Balloon Fight available to me. Now, eventually I would go on to be the kind of kid that the very first thing I would do is rip open the box and read the instruction manual. I don't know if I did that with Balloon Fight. Because I think there is an argument, and we're seeing it a lot more in modern game design, about like, should a game, like, the argument about tutorials, like, a good game doesn't need to have a tutorial, you should be able to understand it from playing it. I think that that's a very philosophical question, and like you said, a very subjective question. Like, and again, like for me, I do feel that there is something to be said about like looking at Balloon Fight and being able to know how to play it just from looking at it, right? Or at least was my experience, and if there's anyone here who had they had no idea how to play Balloon Fight, but they knew absolutely how to play Joust, I'd love to hear that too. These are always interesting things to look at. But because none of this is an exact science, right? So, yeah, absolutely. But yeah.
Well, if I may, can I point out I just wanted to point out one other interesting aspect about Joust as a game. We talked a little bit about this, but there's the element of gravity.
Oh, right, yeah, actually, and that's a question I want to jump over to the other audience too. If anyone knows, we know that 2 different programmers worked on the Versus Balloon Fight and the NES Balloon Fight. If anyone has like a really like good knowledge of what the differences is, particularly with the floating mechanics, because we were talking about how like in Joust it's a little bit slower as opposed to Balloon Fight where you drop like a stone. And I don't know if that was true in the Versus version because I don't really have as much experience with that. So I'd love to hear. The differences there.
Because I remember reading somewhere where Shigeru Miyamoto had talked a little bit about why Super Mario Bros. Ended up being a better game than a lot of these.
Because of the swimming, right?
What's that?
The swimming?
Not just the swimming, but actually his sense of putting gravity and weight behind the character. Some of the things that you don't even really think about when you're playing the game, but it's like when you develop a run and then you push in the other direction to brake.
Right.
You don't brake immediately. You skid.
Right. Yeah. Very fine-tuned mechanics.
Right.
Yeah.
And in Joust, there's a lot of that going on where your bird, even when you're running, you have to hit the joystick several times to stop the bird.
Sure.
And that becomes, I think, an important element of that game because the gravity pulls the bird back and wants to do. And so there's a lot of like nuance there.
Yeah, there is absolutely. Yeah, and that's why I said I was like there are a lot of finite differences that I'm not sure about because I haven't spent a super ton of time with these games, right? You mentioned you've done competitively, so I'm going to open up to other questions now.
Sure. Oh, hey, first of all, great talk.
Thank you.
I do not have a dog in the fight. One thing though is I am actually old enough to clearly remember and be conscious of when both games hit American shores and playing them and loving them.
Yeah.
Question for you: if you can sort of deepen the dimension of signifier, is that
Yeah.
Okay. Is the way you presented it? It seemed to me that you were going on a sort of like a visual pre-interaction Whereas like, so my point is like, I feel that Joust has a lot of really great sounds, especially for the era, and like the little steps
Sure.
when you're a guy, like when you know everything. How much of Signifier? How much weight are you giving that, and how much weight are you giving within Signifier to visual before you touch it, like push pull, or the tactile experience of hearing the sounds as you work with it? Like,
yeah, so that actually is one of the aspects of going back. Let me go back to Norman again. One of the ones we didn't talk about, which is feedback. And people are very familiar with, I think a lot of people are familiar with that term in game design. It's probably the one that's the most talked about is feedback. And basically things like reactions to things that happen when you do something. A signifier is kind of a preemptive, right? Like before you do something. Whereas like feedback is like what happens after you do the thing. So
maybe the next
there are probably is like I mean, I think audio can be a signifier, but I think it's more used as feedback. Okay.
Well, okay, so just on a color side, like crossover all geeks here, like you know, there's this whole argument with sound being part of the whole package. Like, you know, you think of John Williams with like Jaws and Star Wars and how iconic the songs are, Indiana Jones, and then you think of like big hits like Avengers, and it's like, okay, what's the music? You know, Spider-Man is like the closest thing there is to that. So, you know, I want to say like sound, especially with the limited capabilities of older games, like to get really great sounds is huge. And hopefully that gets factored into considerations.
Sure.
Because a lot of times visuals are like what I feel like we
absolutely, yeah. I definitely agree with this, especially because working in game development used to be like we had in-house musicians and audio people mostly, which was not common. And yeah, there were a lot of discussions about music and sound, how that's like kind of like an afterthought, like especially in the game industry, even though it's such an important part of it. So
it's not really fair in the case of Joust, because Joust had the benefit of Williams employees that were also working in the pinball division. They had a lot of work on sound design for pinball games, and so there was a lot of cross between the sound chips and that could contain the same sort of
definitely
sounds. If you listen to some of the early pinball games in the 80s, they sound the same as Joust for a reason.
Other questions?
There's also a Joust pinball.
Yeah, that's right.
So what you said about like the sprites in a very early age, oh my god, I'm a little drunk and I forgot the name of the game.
No worries.
And everybody loves. But putting like your own imagination into the sprites.
Oh, okay,
Is really fascinating, and it got me thinking. Like, I've been playing the new Spyro, as I'm sure like several of us have, and you know, enemies that I had one way of thinking about, suddenly they're like hyper realistic and very detailed. I'm like, oh, I hate that. I hate how that looks. Oh, he's so ugly. And it got me thinking, like, the simplicity of Balloon Fight, and that like the illustration on the cover and on the guidebook or whatever is literally exactly what you get, and it's not like what happens in Joust. And in like an era of constantly evolving graphics and like constantly more complicating game design, do you think that there is room for that kind of simplicity that like Spyro brought us, that like Banjo-Kazooie brought us, and that like Balloon Fight brought us?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're seeing it more in the indie space than anywhere else. But it's cheaper to do, so a lot of people do it. Although now we're starting. There's already been a couple of PlayStation nostalgia projects out there. It's not as super prevalent yet, but I do think we're on the brink. It just needs that one game that has not happened yet. But no, absolutely, but 100%. I think it's going to be mostly the indie space, but the indie space basically is the C/B level developers, because I mean, outside of like maybe Atlas and some other places, they don't really exist anymore. So like that's why like I play a few AAA games, but it's not my main interest now. I mostly play indie titles or downloadable titles. And yeah, I definitely see that abstract stuff there much more.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And I think simplicity is something that definitely plays into these early arcade games. That's what they were all about by necessity, because you just did some.
Right.
What's that?
I said it was hardware.
Right, but I mean, if you,
There
look
you
at,
go.
if you look at Joust 2, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about Joust 2 at all, but
Actually, I'll be honest, I've never played Joust 2.
Okay.
So I got nothing on that one.
so Joust 2 actually was sort of graphically a little bit more elaborate, and I think that was part of why it wasn't a success. Why
Yeah, and that's why I'm definitely gonna check it out because I want to see it how it is.
Check it out.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna go to you, and then we're gonna.
So dovetailing off what you said, I actually don't have any nostalgia associated with Spyro. So I first
To be frank, unfortunately, neither do I. It was one of those games I kind of skipped during that period.
I mean, no hate.
I've never been a huge fan of 3D platformers like that, and I think Spyro would have been one I probably would have enjoyed, but it just kind of fell by
Well,
it.
see, it's hilarious because I love 3D platforms. I just
Oh, okay.
don't have a PlayStation.
That happens too. That happens too.
But I knew of Spyro, so we got the Reignited
Yeah.
trilogy. I'm loving it. But one of the things I've noticed, like talking about affordances, they've upres the grass, and on the old version, it's just a flat green space. And now there's grass.
So like I said, yeah.
And you lose things.
I'll be honest. Again, having not played the original Spyro, I'm watching a YouTube channel called New Frame Plus, which is all on game animation. I'm not an animator, but even if you're not an animator, really great channel. Please check that one out. And he did like his top animations 2018, and he mentioned the Spyro one. And like again, the Reignited trilogy came out. I didn't really play it because again, no real nostalgia there. But then I saw like the level that they went to remaking those games is like that was not what I thought that remake was going to be.
But like, as part of the uprising, they actually got rid of an affordance. Because since it used to just, because I've seen videos of what it used to look like, just a flat green surface for the grass. And now that they actually have like grasses and like texture on the floor, the shadow, and motion blur. And motion blur is very
Yeah.
able to lose track of where enemies are and where gems.
Yeah, and there's a lot to be said right there. That is way out of scope here, and I'm probably not the person to talk about it because, but yeah. Yeah, that's a very common topic that comes up every time there is a remake or an HD remaster, right? And like the Spyro is a remake, but not in the way of a remake that a lot of people think of when they think remakes, where it's like whole new mechanics or different smooth over mechanics. Like no, it's the same game, but so much better. Like again, like I couldn't believe like it now looks like it's Spyro, except it looks like DreamWorks made it. Like it's insane how much work they put into that. But that happens. The loss there. Like I'm not going to talk about the Silent Hill HD collection, but like just the brief search on the internet and go take a look at that one. I want to get to more of the questions. Hey.
I wanted to kind of jump into, because you mentioned tutorials and how it's different from like arcades to consoles. Like with a console, you can include the instruction booklet that pretty much tells you hit this button to do this and hit that to do that. Well, at the same time, if you like so happen to be like, I don't know, 9-year-old kid, you move houses and you lose that instruction booklet, I mean, then you kind of have to be able to like explain it to your friends, or your friends have to be able to kind of see how, like visually, to kind of cues to play the game. And I think in that aspect, Balloon Fight does actually succeed a little more than Joust, because just even looking at the sprites here, with Balloon Fight, you can see where it's pretty clear where you're supposed to hit your opponent, but just looking at the sprites for Joust, I mean, just from that, I don't get any kind of indication that you're supposed to hit him from above. You know what I'm saying?
Right, yeah, and that was kind of my feelings on it too, that you
On
really,
top of that, also,
I mean,
the enemy sprite is different from you. Like he's got like a little bit of a squat head and is a little bit small.
and I do think that like the line, I feel like the actual like pikes that they're holding are supposed to be like kind of a line to show you the elevation. But again, it's one of those things that.
Would you not agree though that watching the attract mode for 10 seconds would really give you the sense of what's going on with Joust?
True, and also with like he's with like crazy. And I noticed that with an arcade machine from that time, after the actual like a little demo mode, there will come up a screen that pretty much says do this and this and this. Like stuff like extra life at like how many points.
Right.
Hit enemies from above.
Sure.
And it'll have like the two sprites kind of like that.
Yeah. We still have a lot of time. Do we have any other questions?
Well, I had one, but I don't think it so much pertains to the actual discussion we are having, but it does kind of relate to aesthetics.
Okay, let me real quick scan the room. Question.
Anecdotal statement related to this. As a kid, I remember being confused by Joust. I
Okay.
didn't actually play, didn't have Balloon Fight. Played that later as an adult, and like the 3DS version that was 3D, very cool. But as a kid, I do remember trying to play Joust and being like, okay, I just bumped into him and I sort of bounced off. What's going on there?
Midway Classics.
Yeah, there you go. And not really getting it initially, but I picked it up eventually.
Gotcha. Okay. Why don't you go ahead and ask? We got about 15 minutes, so it's like, and
I was
yeah.
actually, I've been thinking about this for a while now, about 7 months now, for an exact time frame. But do you think in some regards it goes a bit beyond just basic aesthetics? Like with Balloon Fight and Joust, they're so similar in their gameplay styles and mechanics that it can very well just come down to, well, I like the aesthetics of Balloon Fight over the aesthetics of Joust. But in certain situations, with the culture that has arisen within our own gaming space, I'm sure we're all familiar with E3, right? We can all watch E3 and pretty much tell from watching a demo whether or not a game interests us or it doesn't, right? Well, what if that gameplay demo doesn't do an adequate job showing you all the different mechanics that are at play? For example, I consider myself a member of what I like to call the action game community, which is a group of people that spend the majority of their time playing games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Ninja Gaiden, really technical action games that have a lot of hidden below the surface mechanics. I can show you a high-level Devil May Cry combo, but you might not be able to understand everything that's happening because some of those mechanics are hidden and you might not have been able to find them on a first playthrough. Now, why this came about was because 7 months ago, the new God of War released. And the entirety, almost the entirety of that community pretty much shunned it. But if you look at it, and if I strip away the gameplay, which is what you're looking at, and I tell you the mechanics that are present in the new God of War and compare it to the mechanics that are present in Bayonetta and Devil May Cry, you would be able to look at just the mechanics like Bear and say, yeah, I would play that game. Because the mechanics are, dodge offset, animation canceling, juggling, things like that, right? So how much of it do you think is what the player sees when they see somebody else playing it versus what the player experiences when they play it for themselves? Because from what I've boiled down to is a lot of the members of that community didn't like God of War because if you look at the new God of War, it doesn't look like an action game. The camera's too close. You have a boy companion. It's very walkie-talkie in sections. Whereas if you look at the demo for the new Devil May Cry that just released on Xbox One, there's not a whole lot of walkie-talkie segments. There's high fluent action, a jump button, which is a big one.
Well, like to address the initial question about like if it goes deeper, this talk is really meant to be a primer, right? It's very much, that's why I said when I was going into the definition of formal and functional, if you've taken a Aesthetics 101 class, please bear with me, you already know this. That being, so this is really supposed to be a primer. So yes, I do think it goes deeper than that. That's why when I was talking about like why, again, I don't really think that Joust is necessarily better. I think it comes to individual taste. Like the stuff that you're talking about with like the individual mechanics, that is really what makes the game. I actually don't know your name. We have actually
Darren.
Darren was talking about like how Joust has a lot of very specific mechanics that don't exist in Joust because of those small, minute changes. In the same way that Bayonetta has, there's all the guard canceling, the timing, counting frames, all of that stuff in action games, right?
Yeah.
So that being said, yeah, we do live, like, it's a lot easier now compared to the 70s and 80s and even the 90s where you had to look at the back of the box and you weren't 100% sure what you were getting. Now you can watch a video. I would definitely argue that watching a video is not the same thing as experiencing a game. Like, it might give you a better, like, yeah, and you're right. Like, I would also say that, like, the original God of War, not the new one, but the original God of War technically exists in a different genre than something like Devil May Cry. I mean, they've been given the name stylish action
And
games.
that's
I don't
something we
know.
can go back and forth
Right.
on, and
Yeah, it's all
I
completely
disagree with you,
subjective.
but I get
It's all completely
I
subjective.
see your side of
Right.
the argument. Right?
Well, again, like, and then you get into the whole like what constitutes genre, and then at that point you're just navel gazing.
Yeah.
So it doesn't it doesn't really matter that like I would consider Devil May Cry and God of War to be separate types of action titles. Like, as a game designer, I would tell you that they like engage different aspects of that wider genre. Same way that I prefer the classic Resident Evils over Resident Evil 4. Sorry. But again, on a consumer level, I mean.
Yeah, I
God,
want to say
so
something
slow.
about that because it's an interesting point you raised, and I think some of the things that we have to keep in mind, I think today, is that the game design today is a lot different than it was back in the early 80s. In the early 80s, really, Joust is not a derivative work. Balloon Fight, sorry to say, is more of a derivative work than Joust is, in the sense that when Joust created this idea of one player higher than another wins, they were really the ones doing it. And so from the perspective of being that first person to hit the arcade and then see the arcade machine and go, what the heck is this? And then having to figure that out, that was something that you didn't really have to do necessarily with Balloon Fight if you already understood the mechanics of Joust. Some people didn't, I get that, but I mean, there is that aspect of it. Today, if you had something like the new God of War and you hit somebody with that, it'd blow their mind because they wouldn't have had any precedent whatsoever before it. But the thing that I think most game designers rely on prior games as a crutch more or less because they see it as being, oh, that's something that other people would have seen before to an extent. And so they'll get to a certain point. We don't have to bring them there. They'll get there on their own. So there's that aspect of it too. Back in the early 80s, you had Cuber, you had Joust, you had Pac-Man, and a billion others, Food Fight. I mean, there are a lot of game mechanics that were being developed back then that when we hit the arcades in the early 80s, it was such a cherry high because we were just seeing things for the very first time.
The Wild Wild West.
Huh?
The Wild Wild West.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the indie thing, that same space exists in the indies now because they're all playing with all kinds of crazy mechanics. Anyone see that fighting game that has like 50 million buttons?
Ooh.
I played that at GDC last year and it was so cool, and now it's here at MAGFest. It's so great. I don't know what it's called.
I
It's
believe the official count is 62.
60 buttons.
And
62
how
buttons.
about,
Wow.
Like a point you brought up
Yeah.
about like combo videos and stuff. The problem of conveying stuff to a player is kind of almost gone. The game still kind of needs to explain that to you. But if you're not getting something about a game, we in today's world now can just look up the answer whenever we want. Like if you're not getting the point of Joust, you can just go say, "Hey Siri, what's going on with Joust?" Or if you're not getting the point of
And I've done
Balloon
that
Fight-
with games.
Yeah, if you're not getting the point of Balloon Fight, "Hey Siri, what's going on with Balloon Fight?"
Yeah.
And she'll tell you, that. Or you can go on YouTube and see someone playing it and kind of get it from there.
Yeah. Before we go, I'm sorry. I don't want to go like too crazy because we still have eight-ish minutes left, and I also want to go to the Frank Cifaldi panel after this. Frank Cifaldi, a couple other people are, Kelsey Lewin, I think is her last name. They're doing like weird items in game history. They're going to talk about where in North Dakota is it's charming San Diego. Looking forward to that panel. So before we go like too closer off the rails, I want to see if there are any other questions. Anyone who has not talked have an offshoot about things we are talking about.
I just have a little comment.
Yeah.
I know this isn't the point you're trying to make, but it is kind of subjective. But like a harder learning curve on a game doesn't necessarily make it worse. I know you're not necessarily saying that.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking of the example of when I was a little kid. Something like Mortal Kombat. All I got to do is hit this punch, hit this to kick. I don't know all the combos. So when I was a little kid, I just put in some quarters, get my ass kicked twice, and then that'd be it.
My great memories of trying to learn Street Fighter as a kid and thinking that Dalsim was the best. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, I'm not necessarily even saying that like Balloon Fight has that Joust or that one has a steeper learning curve over the other. It's more just you can tell how to play the game visually, which is a little different. But even what you're saying is no, you're absolutely right. Again, it's all super subjective. Like, I think, again, as a game designer, I do think that the tools that you're using, then these tools, by which I mean like signifiers, you know, you need to be aware of those tools and use them to create an engaging game. Now, there are other tools that I didn't talk about that are beyond the scope of this that Nintendo could have done to make Balloon Fight better. Again, like the vertical orientation of the characters does not really help you. I mean, the stage design supports it more or less, but it's a lot more unwieldy in that way, right? So, yeah, you know,
This is when you have to call the Nintendo Power Line, buy the Prima strategy guide.
Right. Right. All right, 5 more minutes, maybe like 2 more questions, if anyone's got anything. Cool. Well, thank you. Oh, Joe. What's up, bud?
Speaking of aesthetics, did you feel like kind of gross because you liked Tingle's balloon fight? But also it has Tingle?
Do we have Tingle's Balloon Fight? I don't even know if we do. Do we?
Not Tingle's Balloon Fight.
Okay.
We've got the other one.
The other Tingle game.
Oh,
Yeah, the other.
What? There's
the-
more than one?
Yeah, it's like his Ruby Land quest or whatever. Yeah.
Tingle's
You know, to each their own. You know. Why you got a king shame?
I just personally hate Tingle.
I'm mad as fair.
I share in that.
Oh man. All right. Okay. I think we're out of questions. So at that point, great. I'll talk to a few of you on a personal level, and then I'm going downstairs to the next talk. See you, everybody. Thank you.
Well, this guy deserves applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's your sonic feedback I keep talking about.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You said you had trouble figuring out Joust as a kid. Was that in the arcade or was that on?
Both. I'm the kind of like I was the kind of kid, and I don't mind telling people this story. I was the kind of kid that like I had to rent Super Mario Brothers, and even though like my family kept telling me it's the same game as the one you have at home because it didn't have Duck Hunt with it, like I was like, but this version doesn't have Duck Hunt. I gotta play it. Like I gotta see this. I have to know this for myself, okay? You know, so like if I'm gonna see like, oh, it's Joust, I'm gonna check this out. You know, like yeah, like I had like home ports of it. Now I don't know if I ever played a good home port of it. Like I didn't play the Nintendo version that Iwata worked on. Like I had played the Atari 2600 version.
I like that.
I haven't played it since I was like 6. So, yeah, like so yes, but I also had played console versions and it was more or less the same.
Because I would definitely say, as we're saying, conveyance is different, and the medium that they were originally built for changes what they're conveying.
Right.
You know, as we were saying earlier, Joust, an arcade game's mission is to look cool so that you stop and look at it long enough for you to see the demo screen, read what quarter in, and go ahead and play it.
Sure.
Whereas a console game has to convey what you are intended to do without that. It has to pull you in, just by looking at the box, or if you don't have the box, just putting it in. You have to be able to convey, what you're going to do. I feel like that definitely has that different impact. So I was curious, if the confusion that you had as a child with Joust, was that from the arcade, or was that specifically just from the
Yeah, fair. And it's a very fair point. And I was wondering when that question was going to come up. So thank you.
Yeah, it's real estate too, because arcade owners have to pay thousands of dollars for theirs, then thousands of dollars for Joust.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
and that has to compete with all these other systems, these other games that take up space in their arcade. So there's definitely a need for the designer to do something that gets your attention and gets you to that quarter.
Yep, it's true. All right, we're out of time. Thanks again, everyone.